Warning: this is an advanced tutorial. Don't attempt to fix a power supply unit if you don't have proper training or safety equipment.
Since this unit has two inputs, we need to measure the voltage of the second capacitor bank. In this case, we're reading 2.14 volts, which indicates critical damage to the circuit. Most damaged APW9 power supplies show 170 volts instead of 420 volts on the capacitors. This can be hazardous when pursuing the diagnostic test. For safety reasons, we like to discharge the capacitors. To do so, we're using a resistor and plug adapters to read the discharge level on the multimeter. We're now going to consult the schematic of the datasheet to find the value of the broken R32 resistor. Since the damage to this resistor can be caused by the MOSFET or the chip at U18, we're going to replace them. On this particular unit, the MOSFET is attached to a 3 ohm resistor that is not listed in the schematics. We also need to replace it. To do so, we must scrape the silicon insulation that's covering the board. Then we apply flux to desolder the U18 chip and the R32 resistor. Using a heat gun and some tweezers, we melt the solder and lift off the components. We then use a desoldering gun to remove the MOSFET and its resistor. We make sure the through holes are free of any remaining solder before inserting the MOSFET and its resistor. The middle leg of the MOSFET must be bent in order to insert it through the board. We then add flux to solder the MOSFET and its resistor. To do so, we'll use a high-temperature soldering iron. We then cut the excess wires from the through holes before soldering the last components. We need to apply a small amount of soldering paste to the chip's pads before soldering it. We solder the chip and the resistance using a heat gun at 480 degrees Celsius. We conclude the repair process by measuring the resistance of the new components. In that case, we're reading the correct resistance for the 3 ohms and the 0.39 ohm of R32. We can now proceed to read the voltage at the big capacitors, which should read 420 volts. Before feeding power to the board, we need to insulate it from the metal case. Here we're using a cardboard box, but you can also use a silicon mat. In this case, we're reading 420 volts, which is the appropriate voltage for both capacitors. We can then reassemble the unit and test it with its ASIC miner.